Imagine for a moment, you received a promise that seemed impossible, a calling that challenges everything you know, and yet you are instructed to give what you love most to the world. The heart tightens, fear invades every thought, and doubt whispers that perhaps the impossible is truly impossible. But in the silence of the night, under the starry mantle of the desert, a man walks with firm steps, even with a broken heart, because the voice of the Almighty commanded him something that surpasses human reason. This is the story of Abraham, the father of faith, called to give his only son, Isaac, in an act that would define not only his life, but the faith of all future generations. Each step toward Mount Moriah is a step of courage, a challenge to understanding itself, and an invitation to all of us to trust when the impossible is demanded of us. The question that echoes in the silent air is the same that crosses the centuries. Would you be able to obey when everything inside you screams to hold on to what you love? Today we will walk with Abraham, feel the weight of his decision, and witness the moment when faith, love, and obedience meet, showing that God always provides, even when hope seems lost. Every detail, every glance, every step in this journey reveals not just a human test, but a foreshadowing of the greatest sacrifice the world has ever known, and the promise that obedience to God transforms pain into blessing and fear into victory. The sound of the wind passed through Abraham's tents like an ancient whisper, bringing with it the weight of God's promises and the silence of waiting that tests the heart. Abraham observed the stars that the Creator had shown him years before, remembering the voice that had said, "So shall your descendants be." But time had stretched, and faith, however firm, began to be tested by the echo of doubt. Sarah, with tired eyes and an impatient heart, approached Abraham. She proposed something that seemed sensible to human eyes, that Hagar, her Egyptian servant, be given to him as a wife, so that from her the promised child would be born. Abraham in silence consented. Thus the human plan intertwined with the divine, and the once peaceful home became a field of invisible disputes. What seemed a solution turned into conflict, for where faith yields to human calculation, peace slowly slips away like sand between fingers. Hagar, now Abraham's wife, walked proudly among the tents, feeling in herself the honor of carrying the patriarch's son. But pride grew where gratitude should have flourished. The look of contempt she cast at Sarah wounded the soul of the woman who had once been her mistress. Tension filled the air of Abraham's household. Voices rose, gestures became cold, and laughter ceased. Sarah, consumed by jealousy and pain, cried to Abraham, "My wrong shall fall upon you." The patriarch, torn between justice and love, only responded, "Behold, your servant is in your hand. Do to her as seems good to you." Genesis 16:6. Then Sarah afflicted her, and Hagar fled into the desert alone, carrying in her womb the misunderstood promise and the weight of a wounded heart. The silence of the wasteland became her only companion, until the heavens decided to break the abandonment with the touch of the eternal. By a spring, on the way to Shur, Hagar rested. The desert, vast and relentless, seemed to reflect the emptiness in her chest. Then a presence approached, not the wind nor a traveler, but a messenger of God. He called her by name, Hagar, servant of Sarai. Those words, so simple, made her remember who she was and where she came from. The angel said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit under her hands." But along with the command came a promise, "I will greatly multiply your offspring, so that it shall not be counted for multitude. The Lord had heard your affliction." Genesis 16:9-10. There by the spring, tears mingled with the water. The angel revealed to her the name she should give the child. "Ishmael, God will hear." And Hagar exclaimed, "You are the God who sees me." Thus was born the well that would be called Bir Lahi Roy, the well of the one who lives and sees me. Years passed, and God's promise reignited over Abraham like a fire that does not go out. When he was nearly 100 years old, the Lord spoke to him again. "Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac." But Abraham, taken with love for Ishmael, replied, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." Genesis 17:18-19. A father's heart cried out, but the divine purpose took another path. God responded with tenderness and firmness. "Also I have heard concerning Ishmael. Behold, I have blessed him and will make him a great nation." Faith, now matured by delay, began to understand that God's timing is never late. He only prepares the impossible. And so under the patriarch's tent, between promises and silences, hope rekindled. For the God who sees and hears also fulfills. Even if the human heart does not understand the paths through which he leads his own, the laughter of a newborn filled Abraham's tents. It was the sound of a living promise, the fulfillment of a waiting that spanned decades and disappointments. Sarah, now a mother, held Isaac in her arms with tears blending astonishment and gratitude. God has made me laugh. Everyone who hears will laugh with me, she said with a trembling voice. Joy was so deep it transformed even the air. Everything seemed new, reborn. Abraham, with a full heart, saw in this little boy the faithfulness of a God who never forgets. But not all tents celebrated. In the shadow of joy, Hagar saw the dreams she once nurtured crumble. Ishmael, already grown, watched from afar the child of promise, and jealousy began to burn in his chest. The light that once illuminated his name now seemed overshadowed by another's laughter. The entire camp rejoiced at Isaac's weaning, and a great feast was prepared. Laughter, songs, and dances filled the air, but among the sound of flutes one gaze grew bitter. Ishmael mocked Isaac, not just out of brotherly jealousy, but in contempt for God's purpose. Sarah saw it, and in her countenance arose the firmness of one who understands the danger approaching. She went to Abraham and said, "Cast out this servant and her son, for the son of this servant shall not inherit with my son, with Isaac." Genesis 21:10. The patriarch remained silent, torn between the love of a father and the duty of a servant. Memories of Ishmael running through the camp. His laughter, his embraces, weighed heavier than the bronze of the altar. But soon the voice of God would echo over the tears of doubt. The following night, while the wind whispered through the tents, Abraham sought the Lord in prayer. "Lord, what shall I do with the son I love?" The angel appeared to him in a vision, bringing comfort and direction. "Do not be distressed because of the boy and your servant. In all that Sarah tells you, listen to her voice. For in Isaac shall your offspring be called. But also of the son of the servant will I make a nation, because he is your seed." Genesis 21:12-13. The patriarch fell, weeping in silence. At dawn he prepared bread and a skin of water, placing them over Hagar's shoulder. The sun rose over the valley, gilding the sands that would witness the farewell. Abraham kissed Ishmael on the forehead, blessing him with a choked voice. And as he watched them depart, the man who had walked with God felt his heart tear as the veil of an ancient temple. Abraham's gaze followed them until they disappeared on the horizon. The pain of separation was the price of a love that had learned to obey even when the heart bled. And God, who sees all, sustained Hagar and her son in the desert of Beersheba. When the water ran out and despair surrounded them, the angel of the Lord called from heaven, "Do not fear, for God has heard the voice of the boy from the place where he is. Rise, take the boy by the hand, for I will make him a great nation." Genesis 21:17-18. Thus, the same God who had seen Hagar by the spring in the past now opened another spring before her, reminding that his promises do not break, they simply follow different paths. Abraham from afar learned that true faith is not only to believe, it is to surrender, to let go and still trust. But God had not finished his work with Abraham. For his faith to reach the peak of absolute trust, he would be taken to a test without equal. On a silent night, when the fire of the altar had already died down and the patriarch's heart rested in peace, a voice cut the silence like lightning, "Abraham." And he answered, "Here I am." Then the Lord said, "Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will show you." Genesis 22:1-2. Time seemed to stop. The love of a father and faith in God collided within him like stormy seas. The promise that had brought laughter would now be tested by the fire of sacrifice. And the patriarch, bowed under the weight of obedience, took the first step toward the mountain where faith would be purified like gold. The night was silent over Beersheba. The stars twinkled, eternal witnesses of the covenant between God and the man who now trembled in prayer. Abraham, at 120 years old, carried on his shoulders not only the weight of age, but the burden of obedience. Each wrinkle on his face told stories of faith, journeys, and fulfilled promises. The vigor of youth was gone, and his tired eyes longed only for peace. But it was precisely in this time of rest that God asked the impossible. The divine voice. tore through the quiet of the early morning. "Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and offer him there as a burnt offering." Genesis 22:2. The patriarch's heart trembled. The faith that had once made him leave Ur of the Chaldeans would now be called to ascend the mountain of sacrifice. Everything around seemed to scream against that command. The tents full of servants, the faithful animals, the flocks covering the plains, all testified to God's favor. And at the center of it all, Isaac, the joy of the promise, the laughter that had filled the years of waiting. Abraham watched him sleeping, his face calm, illuminated by the light of the fire still burning outside the tent. How could God ask something so unimaginable? The words of the command echoed in his mind, "You shall not kill." Was it a mistake? A cruel test? The patriarch went out alone under the canopy of stars. The wind touched the folds of his cloak, and he lifted his eyes to the sky, where the promise had been made decades before. "Look now at the heavens and count the stars, so shall your offspring be." How to reconcile promises and loss, faith and pain? Satan whispered subtle doubts. God cannot contradict his own law. "You are mistaken, Abraham. This command cannot come from the Most High." But deep within the soul, the divine voice remained unmistakable, firm and serene like the first call. "Go from your land, walk before me and be perfect." Abraham bowed, face to the ground, heart on fire. He prayed as one who struggles between love and obedience. "Lord, confirm me. Speak to me once more. Give me a sign that I understood your will correctly." No answer came. No angel descended. Only silence, the same silence that precedes great acts of faith. And it was in that silence that Abraham decided to believe, even without understanding. Tears wetted the sand, but his feet began to move. Before the sun rose, the man who walked with God was already standing to journey toward the sacrifice. Inside the tent, Isaac slept, unaware of the drama weighing on his father's heart. Abraham watched him for a moment, as one who engraves every feature of the beloved son in the heart. The smile, the sound of his breathing, the serenity of one who does not yet know pain. From afar, the wind brought the tranquil sound of the shepherding. But in Abraham's heart, the noise was different. It was the echo of the divine command, incessant and alive. "Take now your son," Genesis 22:2. He rose, silently woke 2 servants, and prepared the donkey. With trembling hands, he split the wood that would be the altar of obedience. Each stroke on the trunk was an unspoken prayer, a stifled cry among tears. At dawn, when Isaac awoke, he saw his father ready to depart and heard only, "Son, let us offer a sacrifice to the Lord." And so, unaware, he walked with him toward the mountain that would forever change the history of faith. The faint light of dawn touched the curtains of the tent. Abraham entered, his heart pounding as if each beat were a lament. Before him, Isaac slept deeply, the light, serene sleep of youth. The patriarch knelt beside his son, observing every feature, every breath. Memories overwhelmed him like waves. The first smile, the first words, the moment God said, "Sarah, your wife, will give you a son." Now that same God asked the unthinkable. Abraham covered his face with his hands, trembling. His eyes turned to Sarah, who slept peacefully. For a moment, the desire to wake her overtook him, just so she could embrace the son one last time. But he restrained himself. He feared that a mother's love would rise like a wall between him and the divine will. And so, in silence, Abraham made his decision. Obedience would be his only comfort. With a soft voice, he called, "Isaac, my son." The young man awoke and smiled, accustomed to accompanying his father on acts of worship. Abraham spoke to him of a divine command, that together they would offer a sacrifice on a distant mountain. No suspicion arose in Isaac. It was a familiar invitation, an act of routine faith. They quickly prepared. The donkey was loaded, the wood carefully stacked, and 2 servants were called to accompany them. The sun began to rise over the plains of Beersheba, casting long golden shadows over the camp. Abraham looked back one last time, seeing the tents, the flocks, the quiet of home, and knew that when they returned, everything would be different. The son of the promise walked beside him, and the silence between them was heavier than the burden of the wood. During the long journey, words seemed to have fled the patriarch. The wind blew across the desert, and the sound of footsteps mixed with his restrained breathing. Abraham remembered Sarah, the hope in her eyes, the laughter that filled his soul when Isaac was born. How will I tell him, he thought. How explain that God asked what human love cannot understand? At night they camped. Isaac and the servants fell asleep, but Abraham stayed awake, prostrated in prayer. Lord, have you not tested my faith enough? Do not take the boy. Let him live. Tears wetted the ground. He hoped to hear the sound of wings, the glow of an angel, any sign from heaven. But nothing came, only the same sacred silence that seals eternal decisions. And yet his faith endured, like a spark that the wind cannot extinguish. On the third day of the journey, when the horizon began to brighten, Abraham raised his eyes and saw something in the distance. A luminous cloud hovered over a mountain. The patriarch's heart tightened. He recognized in that sign the touch of the Most High. It was Mount Moriah. Doubt ceased. Now certainty burned within him like fire. It is the Lord who spoke. No complaint, no murmur, only faith, a faith that exceeded the limits of reason. Abraham strengthened himself, remembering the promises. In Isaac shall your offspring be called. If God asked for the sacrifice, then he himself would provide the answer. Could not the God who gave life to this boy also restore him from the dead, he murmured, eyes turned to heaven. And so, looking beyond the visible, the patriarch walked toward the altar, where faith and love would meet before the eternal fire. The cold wind blew atop Mount Moriah, raising fine grains of dust that glistened in the rising sun. Abraham held the knife with trembling hands, every muscle tense, every heartbeat a silent prayer. Isaac, a young soul pure and obedient, looked at his father with absolute trust, unaware of the imminence of the final moment. The wood had been arranged on his own body, the altar constructed with hands trembling from emotion and fear. The patriarch heard the sweet sound of his son's voice, "My father." A restrained groan rose from his chest, and he replied with a firmness he did not feel, "God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering." Genesis 22:8. The promise and faith now became his only foundation, while the weight of obedience crushed Abraham's soul. The moment arrived. Abraham raised the knife, and the sunlight reflected off the blade, making it as bright as the stars that once promised his offspring. The silence was absolute, heavy, as if all creation held its breath. Isaac, calm-eyed, remained still, allowing his father to bind his hands gently. Every knot made, every touch on his son's body, was a blow to the patriarch's heart. Tears ran silently, mixing with the mountain dust. Love and obedience, faith and sacrifice converged in that sacred instant, transforming the trial into a silent hymn of trust in God. It was the deepest expression of human faith, where promise and pain met in harmony. Suddenly, the blade froze in midair. A cry cut the silence. "Abraham, Abraham." Genesis 22:11. The patriarch, heart about to explode, replied, "Here I am." The heavenly voice repeated firmly, "Do not lay your hand on the boy, nor do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, and you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Abraham fell to his knees, embracing his son with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and reverence. The air seemed to pulse with the power of the divine presence, and the entire mountain became a witness to the covenant of faith that transcends human understanding. Love, obedience, and trust intertwined in an eternal moment. Behind them, a ram appeared, caught by its horns in a nearby bush. Abraham, filled with joy and gratitude, ran and brought it as an offering in place of his son. Every gesture was a hymn of praise, every step a thanksgiving to God's providence. The altar, which moments before seemed the scene of imminent tragedy, became the place of miracle and mercy. Abraham, looking around and feeling the divine breath upon his soul, gave the place a name never to be forgotten: Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will provide. Our Genesis 22:14. There, atop the mountain, the God who tests, provides, and sustains revealed himself eternally, leaving in the history of human faith the lesson of obedience, trust, and unwavering love. At the top of Mount Moriah, after the cry and the miracle, God renewed his covenant with Abraham, confirming with a solemn oath the blessing that would span all generations. "By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and greatly multiply your offspring as the stars of the heavens and as the sand on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of their enemies. And in your offspring all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." Every word resonated over the mountain, echoing eternally as a seal of divine justice and faithfulness. The patriarch's obedience was not merely an act of courage. It was a living manifestation of faith that illuminates the path of all God's servants, showing that true trust rests not on human understanding but on total surrender to the Lord. Even when the cost seems incomprehensible, Abraham did not seek refuge in human excuses. He did not consider that taking the life of his own son could tarnish his reputation or cast doubts on his character before men. Neither advanced age nor the weight of affections diverted him from the divine command. He recognized that God is just in all his demands and therefore obeyed promptly, even with a torn heart. The patriarch's faith was not mere intellectual assent, but an active, total commitment. He walked trusting that the one who gives life could also restore it, and that the promise made long ago would be fulfilled even in the face of the impossible. Thus obedience became inseparable from faith, revealing the fullness of human love submitted to divine will. The Apostle James declares, "And Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God." James 2:23. And Paul adds, "Those who are of faith are sons of Abraham." Galatians 3:7. But Abraham's faith was not isolated. It manifested in works, for genuine faith is perfected in action. Was not our father Abraham justified by works when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was working with his works, and by works faith was perfected. James 2:21-22. It is not about salvation by passive belief alone. True faith expresses itself in obedience, in acts reflecting trust in God, even amid the severest trials, showing that believing and obeying are two sides of the same spiritual virtue. Christ himself declared to the unbelieving Jews, "If you were Abraham's children, you would do the works of Abraham." John 8:39. And regarding the patriarch, God affirmed, "Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." Genesis 26:5. James reinforces, "Faith without works is dead in itself." James 2:17. John, speaking of love expressed in obedience, summarizes, "This is the love of God, that we keep his commandments." 1 John 5:3. Abraham therefore remains an eternal model, unwavering faith united with obedient action, trust in God beyond human logic, and love capable of total submission to the Creator. Moriah became witness to obedience that transforms promise into blessing and sacrifice into a triumph of faith. On Mount Moriah, Abraham's experience revealed itself to be much more than a personal test. It became a universal lesson, a foreshadowing of the gospel to come through Christ. Through symbols and promises, God preached the gospel to Abraham beforehand. Galatians 3:8. The patriarch's faith did not rest on visible circumstances, but was fixed on the coming Redeemer. Christ said, "Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad." John 8:56. The ram offered in place of Isaac symbolized the Son of God, the perfect lamb who out of love for humanity would give his life. Just as Abraham submitted to the Father's test, God delivered his Son to redeem the fallen race. He who did not spare his own Son, but gave him up for us all, how shall he not also with him freely give us all things? Romans 8:32. Every moment of Abraham's trial foreshadowed, in living symbols, the infinite suffering of Christ on the cross. The purpose of this terrible test of Abraham did not end with personal instruction or the blessing of his offspring, but reached the heavenly realms. Celestial beings, observing the conflict between Christ and Satan, witnessed Abraham's faithfulness, demonstrating that even in the face of extreme sacrifice, obedience would not fail. Satan's accusations, insinuating failure and unworthiness, were refuted before heaven. "Now I know that you fear God, and you have not withheld your son, your only son." Genesis 22:12. Thus, the story of the patriarch's obedience is not only historical memory but an eternal teaching, showing that perfect fidelity to God triumphs over doubt, and that the reward of obedience extends to all generations and all worlds. The magnitude of the scene impressed even the angels. The command to offer Isaac, Abraham's readiness, Isaac's voluntary submission, and the divine intervention with the ram revealed a central principle of redemption. Total obedience is inseparable from divine love and the promise of salvation. When Abraham answered, "God will provide for himself the lamb," Genesis 22:7-8, the heavens contemplated the drama of the redemptive sacrifice that would one day be accomplished in Christ. The light of revelation poured over the celestial observers, who understood more deeply the plan of salvation, God's infinite mercy, and the necessity of faith expressed in action, obedience, and complete trust in the Most High. The lesson of the mountain transcends centuries and worlds, becoming eternal. Thus, the sacrifice of Isaac and God's provision foreshadow the death of the Lamb of God, whose life would be given for the redemption of humanity. Every detail of that journey, the weight of the wood, the silence of the walk, the hand suspended at the supreme moment, symbolizes the work of Christ, suffering, surrender, intercession, and ultimate victory. Mount Moriah becomes a stage of heavenly revelation, showing that faith manifested in works, obedience that defies reason, and trust that does not waver before death, are the paths by which man aligns with divine purpose. The world watches, heaven rejoices, and the story of salvation is written in the full trust of a servant who did not withhold his son, his only son, becoming an eternal paradigm of faith, love, and redemption. And so atop Mount Moriah, we learn that true faith goes beyond belief. It manifests in action, courage, and obedience, even when the heart trembles before the impossible. Abraham showed us that trusting God transforms pain into blessing, fear into victory, and that sacrifices that seem unbearable can reveal the power of divine purpose. Now we ask you, what are the Isaacs in your life that need to be surrendered to the Lord? Reflect, share this message with someone who needs to hear this story, and don't forget to leave your like. This helps spread the word and inspires more people to trust in the God who always provides. If this video touched your heart, like, comment, and share, because just like Abraham, together we can walk in faith, strengthened in hope, in love, and in obedience that transforms lives.